Nottingham has a legend older than any of its criminals: Robin Hood. An outlaw who stole from the rich, gave to the poor, and made the Sheriff of Nottingham the villain. It is a useful myth for a city that would spend the first decade of the 21st century trying to explain away a different kind of notoriety entirely. By 2002, Nottingham was not being talked about because of Sherwood Forest or Brian Clough or the Lace Market. It was being talked about because its streets were producing a volume of firearms incidents that no comparable English city could match. Shottingham. The nickname arrived and it stuck. Behind it were names that Nottinghamshire police spent years, sometimes decades, attempting to build cases against. A crime boss on the Bestwood estate who bribed a serving officer and arranged the execution of an innocent couple in a Lincolnshire bungalow. Brothers who built a parallel empire that stretched to Spain and the Paris airport runway, where 32 suitcases of cocaine arrived on a flight from Caracas. A drill rapper who filmed music videos in Mexico while running county lines across 6 areas. Today we are covering Nottingham's most notorious organised crime figures, generation by generation, case by case. Section 1. The city that earned the name, Shottingham. Leybourne Drive is an unremarkable road on the Bestwood estate, a large council estate that sits roughly 4 miles north of Nottingham city centre. The houses on that road are semi-detached, built in the post-war years from the same materials and to the same layout as hundreds of streets around them. There is nothing in the physical fabric of the road to suggest it would become a reference point in serious organised crime investigations stretching across 3 decades. But in October 2017, when Nottinghamshire police executed a search warrant at an address on Leybourne Drive and recovered a sawn-off shotgun, they were not arriving somewhere unfamiliar. They were arriving at an address on an estate that law enforcement had been watching, investigating, raiding and documenting since before some of the officers involved had joined the force. The Bestwood estate had been, for a very long time, the geographic centre of Nottingham's most serious organised crime. To understand how that happened, you have to understand what Nottingham looked like in the decade before it became notorious. In 1990, the city was a functioning, reasonably prosperous East Midlands centre. It had 2 universities, a manufacturing base, a regional retail economy, and a reputation built around Robin Hood, Lace, and the city's 2 football clubs. What it also had, beginning in the 1980s and accelerating sharply through the 1990s, was the arrival of serious quantities of controlled substances, the infrastructure to distribute them, and a small number of families willing to do whatever was required to control that infrastructure. By 2002, the situation had deteriorated to the point where the city acquired a nickname that has followed it ever since: Shottingham. A play on the city's name that referenced the frequency of firearms discharges in and around the residential streets of the north, east, and south of the city. The label was not coined by a journalist looking for an angle. It emerged from the lived experience of residents, from the police statistics, and from the volume of incidents that had accumulated by the time anyone thought to attach a name to it. The statistics from the early 2000s are specific and they are worth understanding. At the height of what Nottinghamshire police and the local press described as the Troubles in 2002 and 2003, the city was recording a volume of firearms incidents that sat well above comparable UK cities of similar size. Officers were investigating so many serious incidents simultaneously that the force appealed to neighbouring forces for assistance. Investors pulled back. Tourism dropped. In 2002 alone, the 2 Nottingham universities reported a 14% fall in applications, a figure that the Vice-Chancellors publicly attributed to the city's reputation. Revellers began avoiding the city centre after dark. The economic impact of organised crime in Nottingham in those years was measurable, documented and significant. At the centre of that picture, occupying a position that no one who lived in the north of the city could have been unaware of, were 2 brothers. Colin Gunn and David Gunn had grown up in Eastwood before the family relocated to the Bestwood estate. By the time Colin Gunn reached his 30s, he had moved well beyond the petty criminal activity he had been involved in during his younger years, which had included a conviction for cheque fraud. He had built, alongside his brother and a network of trusted associates, what would later be described in court and in police statements as the Bestwood Cartel. The name was accurate. The Guns did not merely deal in controlled substances. They ran the estate as a territorial entity, collecting payments from local businesses, pubs and clubs, framing those payments as protection, and enforcing compliance through violence that was consistent, deliberate, and designed to send messages rather than simply to injure. The physical description of Colin Gunn that emerges from the reporting and court proceedings of that period is of a large, heavily built man, deliberately intimidating in presence, who had embraced his own reputation with something approaching enthusiasm. He was described by those who knew him as fueled by cocaine, prone to paranoid episodes, and capable of acts of extreme violence when he believed his authority had been challenged. His brother David had his own record of serious violence. He had been convicted multiple times before eventually leaving the criminal life. During one incident that became notorious in Nottingham criminal history, David Gunn bit off a man's lips and eyelids during a bar brawl. The culture of the Bestwood Cartel was not one that relied on subtlety. What made the Guns genuinely dangerous to the wider public, however, was not simply their capacity for personal violence. It was the infrastructure they had built around themselves. They had a network of street-level distributors. They had a supply chain. They had, critically, a relationship with at least one corrupt police officer, which gave them a degree of intelligence on investigations that was, for a period, a serious obstacle to those attempting to build a case against them. Police Constable Charles Fletcher later pleaded guilty to corruption charges and was jailed for 7 years for his role in that relationship. The fact that a serving police officer had been feeding information to the Bestwood Cartel was, when it emerged, confirmation of how deeply the organisation had embedded itself in the institutional life of the city. The gun operation ran on fear as much as it ran on money. One associate later told police that he had been subjected to a serious assault after a quantity of amphetamine went missing. The message was structural, not personal. The violence was a management tool. The Bestwood estate, during the years of the gun operation, had a different crime profile from comparable deprived areas in the city. Burglary rates were lower than average. Vehicle theft was suppressed. This was not because the estate was safer in any meaningful sense. It was because the Guns had established a form of local authority that made random, opportunistic crime inconvenient for their operation. Anyone causing trouble in Bestwood without their permission was creating a problem for the family. That kind of territorial control does not look like disorder from the outside. It looks, in a certain light, like organisation. What would eventually end the gun era had its roots in an incident in August 2003 that had nothing to do with the Bestwood estate at the point it occurred. A 22-year-old man named Marvin Bradshaw was shot and killed outside a Nottingham pub. Bradshaw was a friend of Jamie Gunn, a younger member of the wider Gunn family. The Gunn family concluded that the bullet that ended Marvin Bradshaw's life was intended for Jamie. What followed from that conclusion and the chain of events it set in motion will be covered in the next section. But the starting point of the end of the Bestwood Cartel's dominance was that night in August 2003, and the decision that Colin Gunn made about what it required him to do next. The full details of what Colin Gunn arranged in response to Marvin Bradshaw's death, the innocent couple who paid the price for it, and the 35-year sentence that followed are coming up in the next section. The names involved and the specific address in rural Lincolnshire where the operation ended form one of the most documented cases in Nottingham's criminal history. Section 2. Colin Gunn, the Bestwood Cartel, and a 35-year sentence. On August 8, 2004, Joan Sterland and John Sterland were shot dead at their bungalow in Trusthorpe, a coastal village in Lincolnshire. Joan and John were a retired couple. They had moved to Trusthorpe to get away from Nottingham. They had moved because they were frightened of what might happen to them if they stayed. The reason they were frightened was their connection, through Joan's son Michael O'Brien, to the event that had triggered Colin Gunn's determination to take revenge. Joan Sterland was Michael O'Brien's mother. John Sterland was his stepfather. John Sterland had taken Michael in when Michael was 14, after marrying Joan following the death of her first husband. John Sterland had, by all accounts, tried to be a father to him. None of that proximity protected them. Michael O'Brien had shot and killed Marvin Bradshaw outside a Nottingham pub in August 2003. Bradshaw, as described in the previous section, was a friend of Jamie Gunn, and the Gunn family had concluded that Jamie was the intended target. O'Brien was arrested, charged, and convicted of murder. He was given a life sentence in July 2004, with a minimum term of 24 years, later reduced to 18 years on appeal. His behaviour during the trial had made things worse for those connected to him. He threw a cup of water over the family of Marvin Bradshaw in the courtroom. He made remarks about his victim. He shouted at the court that he was not bothered and that he was a bad boy. Colin Gunn, watching from the outside, had concluded that O'Brien himself was now beyond reach. He was in prison. So Gunn turned his attention to O'Brien's family. The mechanics of what followed illustrate the particular ruthlessness of the Bestwood Cartel at its most operationally focused. Colin Gunn used contacts he had developed with corrupt British telecom workers to trace the address to which Joan and John Sterland had relocated. The couple had gone into police protection at some point after recognising the danger they were in. They had been told there was a threat to their safety. They had moved to a remote bungalow on the Lincolnshire coast, in a village they had no prior connection to, in the hope that distance and anonymity would protect them. The Gunn network found them regardless. On the evening of August 8, 2004, gunmen arrived at the bungalow at Trusthorpe and shot both Joan and John Sterland dead. Nobody was ever convicted of pulling the triggers, but the man who arranged it was identified, investigated, and eventually brought before a court. The investigation that followed the Sterland murders was one of the largest and most complex that Nottinghamshire police had conducted to that point. It involved piecing together the network that Colin Gunn had built, understanding the intelligence that the network had been receiving from a corrupt officer, and building a case that connected Gunn directly to the conspiracy to take the lives of two entirely innocent people. One element of the investigation involved Gunn's use of Police Constable Charles Fletcher, the corrupt officer who had been feeding him information about the progress of investigations. Fletcher eventually pleaded guilty to corruption charges and received a 7-year sentence. The discovery of that relationship explained a great deal about why the Gunn operation had been able to operate for as long as it had without successful prosecution. The outcome of the main trial, in June 2006, produced sentences that reflected the severity of what the court had heard. Colin Gunn received a life sentence with a minimum term of 35 years. To be eligible for consideration of release, he would need to serve that minimum term before his case could even be reviewed. The minimum term expires in 2040. As of early 2024, Gunn was held at HMP Long Lartin in Evesham, Worcestershire, and was pursuing legal action against the Ministry of Justice, challenging a decision not to downgrade his escape risk classification. The High Court rejected that challenge in March 2024. John Russell, who had been involved in the conspiracy, received a life sentence with a minimum term of 30 years. Michael McNee received a life sentence with a minimum term of 25 years. Colin Gunn was also, in 2007, handed a consecutive 9-year sentence for bribery of 2 police officers and conspiracy to corrupt. The bribery conviction added another layer to the picture of how the Bestwood Cartel had sustained itself, not simply through violence and territorial control, but through the deliberate corruption of the very institutions that were supposed to dismantle it. The estate itself reacted to the convictions with what would become a documented piece of Nottingham criminal history. After the verdicts were announced, a crowd of approximately 30 people on the Bestwood estate attacked police with petrol bombs and bricks. The reaction said something about the degree to which the Gunn operation had become, for a portion of the community around it, a fixture of local life, rather than simply a criminal enterprise operating on their doorsteps. The Bestwood Cartel was not universally reviled within its own territory. For some residents, its removal represented not liberation, but a loss of the only authority the area had known for years. David Gunn, who had been Colin's brother and partner in the earlier years of the operation, had by the time of Colin's conviction already stepped away from the criminal life. He confessed during a 2006 trial to conspiring to supply amphetamine. His defence counsel made the argument that there was a clear distinction in character between David and Colin, though the name Gunn was, by that point, so thoroughly associated with the Bestwood Cartel that the distinction was difficult to draw publicly. David Gunn eventually went straight, as confirmed in subsequent reporting. His absence from the later chapters of the Bestwood story is itself notable. The fall of Colin Gunn did not leave Nottingham's organised crime landscape empty. The infrastructure that the Gunn era had established, the distribution networks, the territorial logic, the appetite for the supply of controlled substances into the city, did not evaporate when the convictions were handed down. What changed was the name at the top and the generation doing the work. The Bestwood estate, in particular, would become relevant again in subsequent investigations. The address where a sawn-off shotgun was recovered in October 2017 was on Leybourne Drive, Bestwood. The man the shotgun would eventually be traced back to was Craig Moran, a figure who had grown up in the shadow of the Gunn years and who, upon release from an earlier sentence, had decided to try to bring the same kind of operation back to life. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The Dawes brothers operated a parallel empire to the Gunns during the same era, and their story reaches from a semi-detached house in Sutton in Ashfield all the way to Charles de Gaulle Airport in Paris, where 32 unregistered suitcases were pulled from the hold of an Air France flight from Caracas. That case is next. Section 3. The Dawes brothers and the empire that stretched to Spain. A semi-detached house on Tudor Street in Sutton in Ashfield is not the kind of address that suggests the centre of an international drug trafficking network. Sutton in Ashfield is a market town roughly 12 miles north of Nottingham, a place built around the coal and hosiery industries that defined much of the East Midlands through the 20th century. When those industries contracted, the town contracted with them. John Dawes was born in Nottinghamshire in 1968 and grew up in that landscape. By the time he was prosecuted at Nottingham Crown Court in May 2005, the house on Tudor Street was the registered address of a man who had accumulated £8.3 million from a drug empire that stretched across Nottinghamshire and Derbyshire, had 4 former associates placed into the Witness Protection Programme, and who sat through a 10-week trial displaying, in the words of the detective inspector who led the investigation, what appeared to be a complete belief that he would never be convicted. The Dawes operation ran alongside the Gunn era without directly intersecting with it in any public way. John Dawes and the Gunn brothers occupied different parts of the same criminal ecosystem. Where the Gunns built their power on territorial control, extortion, and the open assertion of dominance over a specific estate, John Dawes kept himself deliberately removed from the street level. He relied on runners, couriers, and a series of buffers between himself and the physical movement of controlled substances. One witness described being recruited to carry heroin from a Tesco car park near Newark Way in Nottingham, delivering it to a public house. He had been brought in to settle a debt. He did not deal directly with Dawes on the operational side. That was the design. Dawes built his network to ensure that his own hands stayed clean. The court heard that he was ruthless in enforcing this structure. Members of his organisation were paid and disciplined. Those who stepped out of line were dealt with. The fear within his operation was real enough that 4 of the people who eventually cooperated with police required protection for doing so. The charges that brought John Dawes to court in 2005 were conspiracy to supply Class A drugs, specifically heroin, conspiracy to supply Class B drugs, specifically amphetamine, and money laundering. His father Arthur Dawes and the woman named Rebecca Bridge were convicted alongside him of the money laundering conspiracy. Ryan Smith was convicted of the drug supply conspiracies as well. John Dawes received 24 years for the Class A conspiracy, with concurrent sentences of 12 years and 10 years for the Class B and money laundering charges respectively. The Crown Prosecution Service subsequently pursued a confiscation order of £355,000 under the Proceeds of Crime Act, and High Court action was launched to seize the family home on Tudor Street, valued at £177,486. John Dawes was released from prison in January 2017. He was recalled in January 2025, reportedly for breaching his licence conditions. He died at Nottingham City Hospital on July 5, 2025, aged 56, having been admitted on June 30th. The cause was lymphoma, a cancer of the lymphatic system he had been battling since 2020 or 2021. He was still a serving prisoner at HMP Nottingham at the time of his death. John's brother Robert had taken an entirely different route. Where John operated within Nottinghamshire and Derbyshire and maintained a presence that was regional in scale, Robert Dawes left the United Kingdom in 2001 and did not return. He built a life on the Costa del Sol, initially in Marbella and later in Benalmádena, southern Spain. From there, over the years that followed, he constructed something that the National Crime Agency would later describe as one of the most significant criminal enterprises in Europe. The NCA's deputy director, speaking after Robert Dawes' conviction, described him as having connections in South America, the Middle East, Asia, and across Europe, all of which he used to orchestrate the movement of substantial quantities of controlled substances and the proceeds generated from them. His network was not a Nottingham operation that had gone international. It was an international operation that happened to have roots in Nottinghamshire. The event that brought Robert Dawes' empire into the daylight occurred in September 2013 at Paris Charles de Gaulle Airport. An Air France flight arrived from Caracas, Venezuela. In the hold were 32 suitcases that had not been registered to any passenger. Inside those suitcases were 1.3 tons of cocaine. The street value of that seizure was estimated by French prosecutors at €240 million. NCA intelligence shared with the French Police Nationale and Spanish Guardia Civil indicated that individuals connected to the Dawes network had travelled to Venezuela to arrange the shipment. Among those arrested in the immediate aftermath of the seizure were Italian nationals connected to the Naples-based Camorra. The operation that had produced that cargo was not a one-off. It was a logistics network that had been running for years. Robert Dawes was arrested in November 2015 at his mansion in Benalmádena after Spanish police and NCA officers acting together raided the property. Firearms, cash, and encrypted mobile phones were recovered. He was extradited to France to face trial. Around 80 people connected to or associated with the Dawes network were arrested during the wider operation, including several Nottingham-based associates who were subsequently sentenced at Nottingham Crown Court. The trial in Paris ran through late 2018. On the 21st of December 2018, Robert Dawes, aged 46 and originally from Sutton in Ashfield, was found guilty of drug trafficking and sentenced to 22 years in prison in France. The NCA's assessment of his standing in European organised crime was direct, one of the most significant criminal figures the agency had encountered, with a network that, in their words, literally spanned the globe. The contrast between the two brothers sits at the centre of what makes the Dawes story distinctive within the wider Nottingham narrative. John ran a domestic empire, kept his structure tight, maintained buffers, and was eventually brought down by a 10-week trial in his home city. Robert took the infrastructure further, went international, and found himself prosecuted not in Nottingham Crown Court, but in Paris, for a shipment that originated in South America and was routed through Venezuela. Both brothers spent their adult lives in prison or heading back toward it. The scale differed, the destination did not. What links the Dawes era to the next generation is the Bestwood estate itself, which never fully emptied. The man who tried to revive it after the gun convictions had his own previous sentence, his own Range Rover, and his own plan to stay ahead of the police. He ended up in Dubai. That case is next. Section 4. Craig Moran, the Bestwood comeback, and a flight to Dubai. On a Friday morning in October 2017, officers from Nottinghamshire Police executed a search warrant at an address on Leybourne Drive in Bestwood. The address was a house on the same estate that had been the territory of the Bestwood Cartel during the gun years. The gun conviction had been in 2006. 11 years had passed. What officers found when they entered the Leybourne Drive property was a sawn-off shotgun. The weapon was examined forensically. Investigators established that it had been discharged in Salford in Greater Manchester on 9th August 2017, roughly 6 weeks before it was recovered. The DNA profile found on the weapon matched Callum Sims, a man from Morell Bank in Bestwood. Callum Sims was Craig Moran's cousin. That connection was where the investigation that would eventually be codenamed Operation Encyclic began. Craig Moran, then in his late 30s, had grown up in the shadow of the gun years on the Bestwood estate. He had been part of the criminal ecosystem of the area before the gun's fall. He had a prior conviction that Judge Michael Auty KC would reference directly in his sentencing remarks when Moran eventually appeared before him at Nottingham Crown Court in August 2024. Moran had served time for being the getaway driver in an armed robbery that resulted in the death of a jeweller. Having served that sentence, he had been released. The judge's remarks noted that he had been unable to resist, upon his release, returning to the same patterns. He had begun arranging the delivery of firearms and controlled substances into Nottingham. He had chosen, as the judge put it, to utilise trusted family and friends in the enterprise. Callum Sims was his cousin. Lee Hudson, whose address on Wendling Gardens in Bestwood was raided in April 2018 and found to contain 58 cannabis plants, 131 rounds of ammunition, 2 encrypted mobile phones, and £13,000 in cash, was his nephew. The structure of the operation was family first. The supply line that Operation Encyclic eventually mapped ran between Salford, in Greater Manchester, and Bestwood. The Manchester end was run by Jody Danson, aged 43, of Edmund Street, Salford. Danson and Moran had been in regular telephone contact between August 2017 and August 2018, communicating on both standard mobile phones and encrypted EncroChat handsets. Between September 2017 and September 2018, a courier named John Nunes, aged 43, Danson's cousin, made 29 separate journeys between the northwest and Nottingham, carrying either controlled substances going south or cash payments going north. The firearms recovered during the investigation had also been sourced from Manchester. Danson admitted involvement in acquiring 2 handguns for Moran's operation. A month after the Leybourne Drive raid, in November 2017, officers recovered 2 further handguns inside a car abandoned near Morell Bank in Bestwood, close to Sims's home. By the spring of 2018, the investigation was closing in. A covert listening device had been placed inside Moran's vehicle. Recordings captured him in conversation with Dean Hudson about a search that had taken place at Lee Hudson's address and whether certain items had been found. On July 19, 2018, officers intercepted a vehicle near Junction 26 of the M1, driven by Callum Sims. Inside a JD sports bag on the back seat were 4 kilograms of cocaine and 2 kilograms of heroin. Sims was arrested. Moran, who was on bail for a separate matter involving an affray at a McDonald's restaurant at the time, assessed the situation and made a decision. He removed his electronic tag. He arranged to be smuggled out of England in the back of a lorry. A European arrest warrant was issued. What followed over the next 2 years sits somewhere between a manhunt and a slow collapse. Moran got as far as Marbella on the Costa del Sol. He was attacked there by rivals. He moved again, this time to Dubai. Back in Nottinghamshire, Nottinghamshire Police and the East Midlands Special Operations Unit continued dismantling the network he had left behind. By March 2019, the majority of the operation had been dealt with. Warrant after warrant was executed in Bestwood and Manchester. Associates were arrested. The case was being built for when Moran was eventually returned. In March 2020, Dubai Special Forces entered the property where Moran was living and handed him to 2 Nottinghamshire police officers who had been waiting at the airport. Moran pleaded guilty to conspiracy to transfer a prohibited weapon, conspiracy to supply Class A drugs, specifically heroin and cocaine, and converting criminal property. He appeared before Judge Michael Auty KC at Nottingham Crown Court on 14th of August 2024 for sentencing. The judge described the Bestwood operation as a Premier League level cartel. He noted that Moran had been confident he would never be caught, and that his inability to resist the trappings of conspicuous wealth had brought him back to the position he was now in. Moran, who had claimed to operate as a fitness instructor and attributed his income to hard work, drove an £80,000 Range Rover Sport that cost more than £1,200 a month to lease. He made payments in cash. He had no documented legitimate income of any kind. He was jailed for 24 years. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The full breakdown of everyone Moran brought into his operation, what each of them received at sentencing, and what the Bestwood estate looked like once the last of them were removed, is in the next section. The figures are specific, and so are the addresses. Section 5. How Craig Moran ran his operation and what he left behind. Revelstoke Way, in the Rise Park area of Nottingham, is where Craig Moran was formally recorded as residing in the period before he fled the country. Rise Park sits adjacent to Bestwood, on the northern edge of the city, close enough to the estate that had shaped his criminal education that the distance was more symbolic than physical. Moran's decision to base his revived operation out of Bestwood reflected something beyond geographic convenience. It reflected a deliberate attempt to re-establish the kind of territorial authority the estate had previously been known for. In his sentencing remarks, Judge Michael Aughty KC was direct about what Moran had done upon release from his previous custodial term. He had chosen to bring the trade back to an area that had worked hard to move past it. The judge's description of the operation as a Premier League-level cartel was not hyperbole. It was a calibration of what the investigation had actually found. The structure Moran built leaned heavily on blood ties. His cousin, Callum Sims, aged 37, of Morell Bank, Bestwood, was one of the operation's most active logistics figures. Sims was the man intercepted near Junction 26 of the M1 on July 19, 2018, with a JD sports bag containing 4 kilograms of cocaine and 2 kilograms of heroin in the back of the vehicle. The cocaine tested at a purity of between 78 and 85%, with a wholesale value of £120,000 and a street value of £320,000. The heroin tested at between 60 and 69% purity, with a wholesale value of £40,000 and a street value of £200,000. Sims had made that journey as part of a supply run from the Manchester end of the operation. The drugs had been sourced from Jodie Danson's network in Salford. Lee Hudson, Moran's nephew, aged 26, and of Wendling Gardens, Bestwood, had been waiting at his parents' home to take delivery of the consignment when Sims was stopped. The operation ran on family trust, because family trust was what Moran believed he could rely on. The Manchester side of the arrangement was managed by Jodie Danson of Edmund Street, Salford. Danson and Moran had coordinated through both standard mobile phones and EncroChat encrypted handsets. Danson admitted in his basis of plea that he believed between 30 and 40 kilograms of Class A substances had been delivered to Moran's operation across the course of the conspiracy. He also admitted involvement in the acquisition of 2 of the 3 firearms recovered during the investigation. John Nunes, Danson's cousin, of Asgard Drive, Salford, had made 29 courier journeys between the Northwest and Nottingham between September 2017 and September 2018. 3 separate vehicles were used across those 29 trips. The volume and consistency of those movements illustrated how established the supply line had become before investigators broke it. The sentencing day at Nottingham Crown Court on August 14, 2024, produced the following outcomes. Jodie Danson, 43, of Edmund Street, Salford, received 16 years. Callum Sims, 37, of Morell Bank, Bestwood, received 14 years. Lee Hudson, 26, of Wendling Gardens, Bestwood, received 12 years. Darren Bexon, 39, formerly of Huggett Gardens, Top Valley, Nottingham, who had pleaded guilty to conspiracy to supply Class A substances, conspiracy to supply Class A, and conspiracy to produce a Class B drug, received 12 years. Richard Jones, 51, of Edgware Road, Newton Heath, Manchester, who pleaded guilty to possession of firearms, possessing Class B drugs with intent, possession of Class A substances, and possession of criminal property of approximately £6,000 in cash, received a sentence at the same hearing. John Nunes, 43, of Asgard Drive, Salford, received 3 years and 4 months. Dean Hudson, 25, of Totland Drive, Nottingham, who had pleaded guilty to producing a Class B drug, possessing Class B drugs with intent, and participation in the activities of an organised crime group, received 3 years. Callum Kirk, 26, of Witton Close, Bestwood, who admitted conspiracy to supply Class A substances and affray, received a 2-year suspended sentence. Craig Bailey, 35, of Watkins Avenue, Salford, received 15 months for participation in the activities of an organised crime group. The Bestwood estate in the aftermath of the Operation Encyclic arrests looked different from what it had been during the Moran years or the years that preceded them. Nottinghamshire Police's Assistant Chief Constable Rob Griffin stated after the sentencing that significant progress had been made in the area and that Moran and his associates had been wrong to believe they could reverse it. The estate still carried the weight of decades of association with serious organised crime, but the specific infrastructure that Moran had rebuilt, the supply chain from Manchester, the family network of couriers and storage, the firearms sourced and moved south from Salford, was gone. The judge's point about Moran's inability to resist the trappings of conspicuous wealth was also a point about visibility. The £80,000 Range Rover Sport, the cash payments, the designer hotels. They were the record of a man who believed his own operation was impenetrable. He was extradited from Dubai and sentenced to 24 years after the sawn-off shotgun at Leybourne Drive gave investigators their first thread to pull. The operation that followed was run by a man from Aspley who ran music videos out of Mexico and earned £16,000 a month, while his safe house in Bestwood doubled as a film set. His name was Akeem Chand. That case begins in the next section. Section 6. Akeem Chand, the drill videos, and a life sentence. Melbourne Road is a residential street in Aspley, in the west of Nottingham. In December 2018, a shot was fired at a car on Minver Crescent, Aspley, near that address, in an incident that Nottinghamshire police would later identify as the first in a series of linked firearms discharges that collectively unravelled one of the most visible and operationally sophisticated drug networks the city had seen in that generation. The man who lived on Melbourne Road, and who was arrested following that December shooting, was Akeem Chand. He was 27 years old. He was an aspiring drill musician. He was, in the assessment of the prosecution at his trial, the undisputed leader of an organised crime group that had generated hundreds of thousands of pounds from the supply of cocaine, crack cocaine, and heroin across Nottingham, Mansfield, Kirkby in Ashfield, Sutton in Ashfield, and surrounding areas between July 2018 and June 2019. The prosecutor described him as having the firepower of a small army. The operation Chand ran was built around dedicated mobile phone lines, numbers used to advertise and take orders for controlled substances. The product was then delivered by couriers and enforcers, each of whom was instructed to carry the minimum amount of merchandise at any one time, to reduce the damage caused by any individual stop. The gang maintained a network of safe houses in which both substances and firearms were stored. One of those properties, in Bestwood, was used as a backdrop for a music video that the group posted publicly online. The Bestwood safe house appeared in a professionally shot video in which gang members displayed substances, cash, and jewellery. The video was not an anomaly, it was characteristic of the way Chand operated. The display was the point. The visibility was deliberate. Between July 2018 and June 2019, Chand and his associates spent what they earned at a rate that matched their ambition to be seen spending it. In March 2019, several members of the group, who between them had almost no documented legitimate income, flew to Mexico's Caribbean coast. They stayed in a private villa. They hired a luxury motor yacht. Both locations were used as settings for a professionally produced music video in which gang members discussed their earnings, referenced their need for a money counter to manage the volume of cash, and posed with jewellery. Chand himself had been captured in earlier videos, transitioning between a £10,000 Rolex watch and a £20,000 Rolex watch, as a marker of the operation's progress. Judge James Sampson, at the sentencing, told Chand directly that he had boasted of earning £16,000 a month through exploiting and distributing harmful substances to addicts across Nottinghamshire. The judge described the music videos as glorifying a criminal lifestyle that was, in his words, an evil cancer on the community. The firearms dimension of the case arrived in the courtroom through a series of specific incidents. On the 13th of December 2018, a shot was fired at a car on Minver Crescent, Aspley, suspected to contain rival gang members. Chand was arrested for that offence. On the 9th of May 2019, in the Basford area, Chand and Cornell Simpson had a chance encounter at a set of traffic lights with members of a rival group. An exchange took place. Chand and Simpson went looking for them. Around 15 minutes later, they found them in Brindley Road, Bilborough. Simpson drove head-on toward the rival vehicle to block its path. Chand exited on foot and approached the car. He fired a .44 caliber revolver at close quarters. The bullet struck the occupant in the neck. Chand discharged 2 further shots as the car sped away. The entire sequence was captured on the victim's dashcam. Unbeknown to Chand, a listening device had also been placed in his vehicle, and investigators had been recording conversations in which the gang discussed the supply of substances and the shooting of rivals. The sentencing at Nottingham Crown Court in October 2021 produced the following outcomes. Akeem Chand, aged 27, formerly of Melbourne Road, Aspley, was jailed for life with a minimum term of 20 years. Judge Sampson told him that he was a ruthless and criminally ambitious individual who had power over others and who would never relinquish that power voluntarily, including from within a prison. Devonte Newfill, aged 26, of no fixed address, was jailed for 20 years. Orlando Escoffrey, aged 28, formerly of Fenton Road, Basford, was jailed for 23 years. Kiefer Smith, aged 30, formerly of Dorman Close, Hucknall, was jailed for 17 years. Alexandro Woolery, aged 29, formerly of Portland Road, Carlton, was jailed for 22 years. Cornell Simpson, aged 26, formerly of Nuthall Road, Aspley, was jailed for 20 years. Ravan Mather Simpson, aged 27, formerly of Mansfield Road, Sherwood, received 10 years and 4 months after pleading guilty to conspiracy to supply Class A and B substances. A woman, Sarah Aplin, aged 29, formerly of Whiton Close, Bestwood, had previously admitted to allowing a premises to be used for the supply of controlled substances. 3 further members of the network were convicted at a retrial that concluded on November 28, 2023. Jaden Gorowoda, aged 28, formerly of Tenbury Crescent, Aspley, was jailed for 22 years. Jason Millety, aged 33, formerly of Longdale Road, Sherwood, received a life sentence with a minimum term of 14 years due to a previous conviction for possession of a firearm with intent to endanger life. Damien Martin, aged 41, formerly of Whiton Close, Sherwood, was jailed for 14 years. Zach Charles, formerly of Hofield Crescent, Bulwell, who had been convicted at an earlier stage of the proceedings of possession of a firearm with intent to endanger life, conspiracy to possess ammunition, and conspiracy to supply Class B substances, had his total sentence extended by 18 months for the Class A conspiracy, bringing his overall term to 10 years. Across all proceedings arising from the investigation, the combined custodial terms exceeded 170 years. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The Meadows is a district in South Nottingham, closer to the city centre than Aspley or Bestwood, and it had its own gang war running simultaneously. The figure at the centre of that conflict had been released from a previous prison term and was trying to take back territory. The events of November 10, 2021, at Wilford Crescent West, put an end to that attempt in the most violent way possible. That case is next. Section 7. Tremaine Mackenzie, the Meadows Turf War, and Operation Haversack. Wilford Crescent West is a residential street in the Meadows, a district in the south of Nottingham that sits just below the city centre and close to the River Trent. At 10:20 p.m. on 10th November 2021, a man named Michael Anton O'Connor, 31 years old, originally from Alexandra Park and known widely as Anton, was found collapsed on the pavement in that street. He had been stabbed. Police and paramedics attended. He was taken to the Queen's Medical Centre. He did not survive. The investigation that followed, codenamed Operation Haversack by Nottinghamshire Police, would take more than 2 years to complete, would involve 2 separate trials at Nottingham Crown Court, and would produce combined sentences across both proceedings that exceeded 355 years. The event at the centre of it was a drug war for control of the supply of heroin and crack cocaine into the Meadows. Michael Anton O'Connor had not been the intended target. He had been sent to broker a deal between the 2 sides. His killers mistook him for someone else. The man the killers were looking for was Tremaine Mackenzie. Mackenzie, then aged 30, lived on Barrant Walk, Bestwood. Bestwood appears again, as it does throughout this video, as the residential address for a figure reaching into a different part of the city's drug trade. Mackenzie had a history that the court would hear in detail. He had 2 previous convictions for possessing a bladed article from 2008 and 2013. In 2017, he had been jailed for 4.5 years at Nottingham Crown Court after CCTV footage captured him on Wilford Street in the early hours of 9th April, attempting to attack a man with a knife and instead slashing a 22-year-old woman on the leg, leaving a wound described in court as hanging open. Judge Stuart Rafferty had told him at that sentencing that the footage showed precisely how dangerous what he had done was. Mackenzie served that term, was released, and upon his release began attempting to establish control over the supply of heroin and crack cocaine in the Meadows. The prosecution at the second Operation Haversack trial, led by Christopher Donnellan KC, set out exactly what Mackenzie had been doing in the period leading up to the 10th of November 2021. He had moved into the Meadows with an organisation around him, using violence and intimidation to establish a foothold in the local trade. That encroachment had provoked a response from the rival group already operating in the area. The meeting that was arranged on the night of November 10th was ostensibly a negotiation. It was, in the prosecution's framing, a pre-arranged ambush. Michael Anton O'Connor was sent by Mackenzie to attend in Mackenzie's place. He was stabbed to death on Wilford Crescent West. He was not who the other side was there for. The man they wanted was the one who had sent him. Mackenzie, on learning that contact with O'Connor had been lost, gathered his associates. Within minutes of the events on Wilford Crescent West, Mackenzie's group had armed themselves and moved to find the rival side. CCTV footage captured what happened next. Mackenzie and his associates tracked down Paula Usherwood, a member of the rival group who had been present at the events that had just taken place. They cornered her in Mickleden Close, a short distance away. Mackenzie raised the self-loading pistol and fired. It failed to discharge. The weapon either misfired or jammed. As Mackenzie worked to clear the malfunction, the gun ejected a cartridge onto the ground. Usherwood escaped. She was later convicted of involvement in the events of that night during the first Haversack trial and sentenced as part of the 270+ years handed down in that first set of proceedings in 2023. The second trial focused on Mackenzie, his associates, and the linked conspiracy to supply Class A substances that had been the commercial basis for the entire conflict. The jury heard weeks of evidence, including expert imagery analysis of CCTV footage that placed Mackenzie and others at the relevant locations. Guilty verdicts were returned in August 2024. On the 20th of September 2024, the defendants were sentenced at Nottingham Crown Court. Judge James Sampson, who had also presided over the Akeem Chand sentencing, addressed Mackenzie directly. He said it was inevitable that Mackenzie and his group would come into violent conflict with others dealing Class A substances in the Meadows. He noted that Mackenzie's activities had antagonised rivals in a way that had directly contributed to the events of that night. He stated that Mackenzie had knowingly been in possession of a loaded firearm that was capable of being discharged, and that it had been highly foreseeable that a discharged round could have struck a house, a window, or a bystander. Tremaine Mackenzie, aged 32, formerly of Barrant Walk, Bestwood, received a total sentence of 20 years and 3 months, with a 5-year extended licence. He had pleaded guilty to conspiracy to supply Class A substances and was found guilty at trial of conspiracy to possess a firearm with intent to endanger life, conspiracy to possess ammunition without a firearm certificate, and conspiracy to have a bladed article in a public place. Jezekiel Dennis, aged 21, of Lightwood Road, Buxton, was found guilty at trial of all the same firearms and conspiracy to supply charges and received his sentence at the same hearing. Kishan Vyas, aged 29, formerly of Lammas Gardens, the Meadows, who had pleaded guilty to conspiracy to supply Class A substances, was sentenced to 9 years and 2 months. Elka Watson, aged 34, of McGregor Close, Birmingham, who had also pleaded guilty to conspiracy to supply, received 4 years and 5 months. 3 further defendants were sentenced to a combined total of 21 years and 11 months, their identities withheld by order of the judge. A 10th member of the group, James Dorr, aged 28, of Hucknall Road, Carrington, had been found guilty separately and was due for sentencing at the end of September 2024. The next case moves away from the streets of Aspley, Bestwood and the Meadows and into the Snenton area, where a network operated through 4 named phone lines and came apart on the M1 motorway, in a hotel room in Radford, and through a supplier quietly importing cannabis from California. The name on the SID line was Akeem Chand. Section 8. The Snenton Network, the SID line, and the M1 stop that cracked it, Holborn Avenue, is in Snenton, a district in the east of Nottingham, roughly 2 miles from the city centre. In October 2020, a car was stopped by officers from Nottinghamshire Police in Nottingham city centre. The driver was Amir Adil, aged 30, of Sedgley Avenue, Snenton. Inside the car were Class A and B substances. Inside the car was also a mobile phone. The phone, when examined, showed regular patterns of contact with 2 drug lines that investigators did not yet fully understand. The stop of Adil's car was the first loose thread of what would become a lengthy and complex inquiry. By the time Nottingham Crown Court sentenced the 8 defendants whose cases arose from that inquiry on 9th May 2024, the combined custodial total had reached 82 years. The gang leader, whose address was on Holborn Avenue, Snenton, was Akeem Chand. The operation Chowdhury ran with his associates used 4 distinct mobile phone lines to advertise, take orders for, and distribute Class A and B substances. 2 of those lines had specific names that appear in the police record and the court proceedings: the SID drug line and the super drug line. The names were used openly in communications between dealers and customers. The gang was not attempting to operate without a visible commercial presence. The lines were advertised, orders were taken, and deliveries were arranged. The product range was extensive. Between July 2019 and December 2021, hundreds of thousands of pounds worth of cocaine, cannabis, MDMA, ecstasy tablets, ketamine, and prescription medication moved through the 4 lines. Akeem Chand, alongside Raja Ahmed and Raja Khan, controlled the lines at different points across that period, each taking responsibility for day-to-day management as the investigation began to pick at the structure. The cannabis supply side of the operation had its own supply chain embedded within it. Majid Hussain, aged 42, of Rifle Street, Radford, was the network's bulk cannabis supplier. Officers established during the investigation that Hussain was not simply moving cannabis he had acquired domestically, he was importing it directly from California. The specific detail of a Nottingham-based drug network drawing cannabis supply from California sits at the more operationally ambitious end of what Nottinghamshire Police were dealing with in that period. Hussain was one of 10 individuals ultimately implicated by the investigation. The M1 stop in January 2021 was the second significant breakthrough. A car containing Raja Ahmed was intercepted on the M1 between Bradford and Nottingham. 2 drug line phones were seized for the first time. Those phones became a new thread in the investigation, and from them, the picture of the operation became considerably clearer. In June 2021, intelligence brought officers to a hotel in Radford. Raja Khan, aged 29, of Daleview Road, Bakersfield, was at the hotel. When officers searched the room, they found substantial quantities of high-purity MDMA, cocaine, and cash. CCTV footage taken from the hotel in the days before Khan was detained placed 2 further members of the network at the location: Wajahat Latif and Shujat Latif, both later arrested. The Radford hotel room was the operational intersection of a drug line network and a supply chain that stretched from California to Snenton to a hotel corridor and was taken apart 1 stop at a time. As the arrests accumulated and the drug line phones were removed one by one, Chowdhury was forced to take more direct personal control. He moved to handle the phones himself, a response to the erosion of the structure beneath him that made him more visible to investigators rather than less. Following an 8-week trial, on May 3, 2024, Chowdhury, Ahmed, and Khan were all found guilty of conspiracy to supply Class A substances. Sentencing at Nottingham Crown Court on 9th May 2024 produced the following outcomes. Akeem Chand, 31, of Holborn Avenue, Snenton, received 10 years and 10 months. Raja Ahmed, 31, of Colwick Road, Snenton, received 10 years and 10 months. Raja Khan, 29, of Daleview Road, Bakersfield, received 9 years and 8 months. Majid Hussain, 42, of Rifle Street, Radford, received 14 years. Amir Adil, 30, of Sedgley Avenue, Snenton, received 4 years and 8 months. Roshan Khan, 25, of Daleview Road, Bakersfield, received 10 years. Wajahat Latif, 27, of Hillcrest View, Carlton, received 12 years and 6 months. Shujat Latif, 25, of Hillcrest View, Carlton, received 9 years and 6 months. Detective Constable Steve Fennin of Nottinghamshire Police's Serious and Organised Crime Team noted after sentencing that this was not the first time the group behind the SID line had faced prosecution, and that organised crime groups operating phone-based drug lines often simply reactivate numbers in new handsets when one is seized. The SID line's history as a recurring feature of Nottingham's drug line landscape added a layer of institutional persistence to what might otherwise look like a single conspiracy. The 4-line network, the California import route, the hotel room in Radford, all of it was methodically unwound through a sequence of stops, arrests, and court appearances that took years from the first seized phone to the last sentenced defendant. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next case involves 13 drug lines simultaneously, a 16-year-old sleeping at a gang member's house and being used to move substances, and a supply reach that extended as far as Aberdeen. That operation was sentenced in June 2025. It leads directly into the most recent case in this video, the taxi arrest on the A617 near Newark in July 2024, and the 15 sentences handed down in January 2026. Section 9. The 13-line County Lines Empire and the Scottish Connection. Bluebell Hill Road is an address in Nottingham that appeared in court proceedings in June 2025 as a major hub for one of the most operationally expansive drug distribution networks Nottinghamshire Police had dismantled in recent years. The network operated 13 distinct drug lines simultaneously. It supplied heroin and cocaine to customers across Nottinghamshire, Derbyshire, Lincolnshire, and Leicestershire. One line extended as far as the Aberdeen area of Scotland. 12 offenders were sentenced at Nottingham Crown Court on the 3rd of June 2025 for their involvement in the conspiracy, receiving a combined total of 130 years. At the top of the structure sat 2 men. Sifo Nkube, aged 29, was a leading figure who had written notes recovered by officers in which he boasted of aiming to earn £20,000 a week from the operation. He wore Rolex watches, posted images with designer clothing and bundles of cash, and was found in possession of bladed articles on multiple occasions, continuing to offend while on bail from earlier arrests. He was jailed for 15 years. Jefti Fikula, aged 29, operated alongside Nkube at the senior level and was convicted not only of conspiracy to supply Class A substances, but also of possession of a firearm with intent to endanger life, possession of an imitation firearm with intent to cause fear of violence, and possession of ammunition without a certificate. His sentence reflected those additional convictions. The network used bulk phone messaging and sophisticated marketing to reach customers across a geographic spread that covered Sutton-in-Ashfield, Mansfield, Hucknall, Grantham, Spalding, Long Eaton, Ripley, Ilkeston, and Colville, in addition to Nottingham itself. Ramon Campbell, convicted of conspiracy to supply and possession of a prohibited firearm, received his sentence alongside the others. Jasaniel Grant, aged 26, who shared day-to-day running of the Nottingham operation with Terrell Comrie Patterson from the Bluebell Hill Road address, was caught during an April 2023 raid in the act of attempting to throw away cocaine and heroin. Comrie Patterson, aged 28, had been controlling a 16-year-old boy who was sleeping at their home and being used to transport substances between locations. Aidan Farrer, aged 21, ran a line in Long Eaton and Stapleford that distributed more than 7,000 bulk messages. Godpraise Bowen, aged 22, ran 2 of the network's most lucrative lines in Hucknall and Spalding and also handled wholesale supply. Bailey Reid, aged 25, managed storage, including 1.5 kilograms of powder used in the production of crack cocaine. Laquan Fogo, aged 20, was directly involved in the production of crack cocaine and controlled the Sutton-in-Ashfield line for a period. Amang Kanyi, aged 25, convicted after trial, ran lines to Colville, Mansfield and Long Eaton. Detective Inspector Luke Todd noted that investigating a single drug line is a complex undertaking and that 13 lines had been linked to one group. The final case in this video is the most recent. A taxi stopped on the A617 near Newark in July 2024. Two men attempting to flee the county, drug phones hidden inside tins of paint, and 15 people sentenced at Nottingham Crown Court on 14th of January 2026. That is next. Section 10. Andrew Fitzgerald, the taxi arrest. And what every generation proves. The A617 is a road that runs east from Nottingham toward Newark. On a day in July 2024, a taxi travelling that road was stopped by officers from Nottinghamshire Police. Inside were Andrew Fitzgerald, aged 35, of Leybourne Drive, Bestwood, and Sean Richardson, aged 34, of Green Lane, Clifton. Both men were attempting to leave Nottinghamshire. Nottinghamshire Police had uncovered their operation. The two men were taken into custody on the A617. Elsewhere, as warrants were being executed at addresses connected to the conspiracy, another member of the network attempted to dispose of two drug phones by dropping them into tins of paint. Officers found them. The evidence was recovered. The operation that Fitzgerald had run between January 2023 and July 2024 used 5 distinct mobile phone lines to distribute crack cocaine, cocaine, and heroin across the Kirkby-in-Ashfield, Sutton-in-Ashfield, and Eastwood areas of Nottinghamshire, and into Skegness in Lincolnshire. Stash houses in Bulwell and Bestwood stored the substances, weapons, and cash between deliveries. Judge Stuart Rafferty KC, in his sentencing remarks on the 14th of January 2026, said there was no doubt the conspiracy was Category 1, and that at least 15 kilograms of Class A substances, possibly as many as 20, had been trafficked by the group. He described an enterprise that operated daily, was busy for much of the day, and would have continued indefinitely had it not been dismantled. More than £40,000 in cash, high-value jewellery, an air pistol, knives, and a crossbow with arrows were seized across the warrants. The 15 sentences handed down on 14th of January 2026 were as follows. Andrew Fitzgerald, 35, of Leybourne Drive, Bestwood, jailed for 12 years. Aaron Miller, 35, of Vernon Road, Kirkby-in-Ashfield, jailed for 11 years. Sean Richardson, 34, of Green Lane, Clifton, jailed for 8 years. Nathan Sharp, 34, formerly of Forest Street, Kirkby-in-Ashfield, jailed for 8 years. Andrew Cox, 41, of Glenside, Kirkby-in-Ashfield, jailed for 8 years. Craig Beeson, 41, of Pear Tree Court, Nottingham, jailed for 8 years and 9 months, with an additional Section 20 GBH conviction. Corey Graham, 24, of Hillington Rise, Bestwood, jailed for 6 years. Tyrone Shand, 38, of Linby Street, Bulwell, jailed for 6 years and 9 months. Keenan Williams, 36, of Belconnen Road, Bestwood, received 18 months suspended for 2 years. Jamie Buxton, 26, of Harcourt Street, Kirkby-in-Ashfield, received 18 months suspended for 2 years with a drug rehabilitation requirement. Stacey Beeson, 39, of Bancroft Street, Bulwell, received 18 months suspended. Yvette Davis, 56, of Laurel Grove, Kirkby-in-Ashfield, received 2 years suspended. Claire Lidgett, 41, of Glenside, Kirkby-in-Ashfield, received 18 months suspended. Step back from the individuals for a moment and look at what the full sweep of this video actually shows. Colin Gunn ran Bestwood through extortion, steroids and fear, and received a 35-year minimum term in 2006. John Dawes built £8.3 million in a network deliberately insulated from the street and died in HMP Nottingham in July 2025. Robert Dawes went international and was sentenced to 22 years in Paris in 2018. Craig Moran tried to bring the Bestwood trade back, fled to Dubai, and received 24 years in August 2024. Akeem Chand ran music videos from Mexico and fired a revolver on a residential street and is serving life with a 20-year minimum. Tremaine Mackenzie cornered a rival in Mickleden Close and pulled the trigger on a pistol that failed to discharge and received 20 years and 3 months in September 2024. Aqil Chowdhury ran 4 named phone lines, including the SID line, and received 10 years and 10 months in May 2024. The Nkube and Fikula network ran 13 lines to Aberdeen and received 130 years combined in June 2025. Andrew Fitzgerald was arrested in a taxi on the A617 and received 12 years in January 2026. The address on the warrant that started Operation Encyclic was Leybourne Drive, Bestwood. The address given for Andrew Fitzgerald at the January 2026 sentencing was Leybourne Drive, Bestwood. Nearly 3 decades of Nottingham criminal history, and the same street appears at both ends of it. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.